Hey everybody, welcome to Remnant Radio. My name is Joshua Lewis, and we've got an exciting episode for you today. We've got Jeramie Rinne on the other line. We're going to be discussing church leadership, elders, that kind of thing. It's going to be an exciting episode. I've read these books. I've listened to these sermons. This is going to be an episode that you guys are going to...
You love church governance,
I love it. I have a
special
place in my heart for church governance. Most of that is, I knew my audio was about to come on. Most of that's rooted because of my background, and I think that, man, a lot of pain could have been just kind of glossed over. It would have never happened had there been proper
That's the case a lot
leadership.
of times. I mean, if the right structure makes a big difference. And so that's what we're going to talk about today with Jeramie Rinne. And we're going to introduce you to him in just a moment. But before we do, I want to let you guys know just kind of what we have coming up tomorrow. Really excited about this episode. Max Lucado is going to be on the show. And Max Lucado has become a continuationist. He's begun to believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And so he comes from a Church of Christ perspective. It's kind of a wild story. And so he's going to be on talking about his story in regard to that and some of the sort of biblical theological background and undergirding for why he made that shift. So that's going to be tomorrow at 11:30 Central Time. We actually have two shows tomorrow. 4 p.m. we'll have Joel Richardson talking about messianic prophecies. He just wrote a book called Sinai to Zion. I've read it. It's a great book, and he's very much into the eschatological scene. So if that's you, you're definitely going to want to check it out. And today, as we mentioned, we're talking church leadership. We do episodes on this periodically. We had a great episode with Dr. Crawford Loritz a little while ago, back this summer. Make sure you search for that episode because it was just a great episode on a similar topic. But Jeramie, we're so excited to have you on the show today. So maybe you could tell us just a little bit about yourself and about your ministry.
Hey, thanks, guys. Great to be on your show. Really an honor to talk about this topic with you. So I'm just a pastor. I pastored a church in Boston for about 20 years on the South Shore of Boston, and then moved to the Middle East, to Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates, where I pastored for 4 years at a international church there. And I've recently taken a new church, moved back to the United States here in Sanibel, Florida, the seashelling capital of the world, where you can not waste your life and collect seashells simultaneously. So, yeah, it's great, though.
I love that John Piper reference there.
Yeah, Sanibel Community Church.
Cool. So tell us a little bit, this book that you've written, Church Elders, that you published with 9 Marks. I really want to know about that. I want to know about that. I want our audience to know about that. I loved the book, and maybe give us kind of a quick intro to what that was.
Sure. So the book is, I would call it like a job description for lay elders. I was we had elders in our church in Boston, and I was always trying to train them and equip them, and so was looking for resources, and really didn't have sort of that small job description book I could just hand to our lay elders. So as I wrote it, I kind of always had in my mind's eye, the portfolio manager in my church and the electrician and school principal who are going to serve as elders, and they just want that pithy summary of like, what do I do? What's this job? What does it mean to be an elder? Because otherwise, I think guys just sort of import in their life experiences in leadership and whatever they are, which isn't all bad. But if you're not coming in with a biblical framework, you sort of impose categories onto the church that don't quite fit.
That's good. So maybe you could give us that pithy explanation. What is the role of an elder?
That's a great question. It's several things. I think at the core of it, the image that helps me sort of pull it all together is that of a shepherd. It's someone who's shepherding. So that means you're leading, you're overseeing, you're feeding, you're knowing the flock, you're among the flock. And at least in our context in Boston, a lot of times guys were coming into the elder board, elder team with a kind of businessy background. It was sort of like the board of directors, So there's the board of directors, and they hire the CEO, that's the pastor, and then he goes and like runs the organization, and then he comes to them for approvals and things. And really trying to say, no, you guys, like whatever you think I'm supposed to be doing as a pastor, that's what you guys are supposed to be doing. And maybe I have more time to give to it, and maybe I have some more expertise or experience, or training, but it's the same job, which is to feed people the Word of God, to shepherd people, to care for souls, and to lead, to oversee the church. Yeah.
What do you think? Like, it feels as if there's a rise in conversations about ecclesiology and church governance and those kinds of things. Do you think that's a result of pragmatism, of us trying to just create the utopiastic church with the best leaders, or do you think this is maybe a response to previous church hurt, where things just haven't worked out, and they think that maybe if we have proper checks and balances, things can actually move forward in a healthier way?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect for a lot of people, there's a kind of maybe for younger pastors who seem to really be interested in polity. There's sort of like this inordinate interest in church polity these days, and I think part of it is because people have tried all the different models, this best-selling church, that model, and it's at the end of the day, you're like, are we just making this up? Is this just like, mirroring the world, or is there like any guidance in Scripture? And so if we really believe in the sufficiency of Scripture, then we want to say, well, what does God have to say about his own church? And remarkably, elders, there's a lot in the New Testament and the Old Testament too about elders, in particular as part of that answer to the question, how should the church be ordered and structured and led? And it's refreshing, it's just great to be able to open your Bible and be like, let's do that. As opposed to like, well, maybe I should do what that guy does because his church, he started with 100 people in his living room or 10 people, and now it's 10,000 people. So something must be working, however you define working, right? So
yeah. So talk to us about the different forms of church government: Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Congregational. Can you just walk us through those different models and maybe like what's your fave?
Pick your poison.
Well, the cool thing is that in all of them, elders can function, and you can find elders in all of them. And in a congregational model, the authority, the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, Matthew 16, Matthew 18, I think, ultimately resides with the congregation itself. So they have the ultimate authority to define doctrine, to bring members into the church, to discipline members out of the church. The next model would be like a Presbyterian model where the local church is under a presbytery, but that presbytery is also part of a larger group of elders. And in the Presbyterian model, the keys to the kingdom are owned by the congregation, but exercised by the elders. And so the elders have a kind of elder rule aspect to them. And then in episcopacy, of course, there's it's even more hierarchical, where you have, pastors or priests underneath, a bishop, and maybe underneath an archbishop, or in the Catholic Church underneath, cardinals and popes. So that the authority rises up, and the keys of the kingdom are with the papacy ultimately. So I'm personally a Congregationalist, so I would ascribe to what I would call an elder-led, congregationally ruled form of church government. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of the intro, you had talked about certain people imposing categories on elders. Can you maybe unpack that for us? What are some of the categories that get imposed that are not inherently biblical?
So I think business board of directors, a bunch of guys, we meet once a month. And we make decisions, and we're kind of the no committee. Like, pastor brings ideas, and we say yes, no, we can't afford that, we can't afford it, and so it's about sort of passing decisions on. For some, it's maybe it's a work committee that wants to get around and work on the facility or manage the property, and I think some people are just wired more toward managing property, which is a great gift to the church, but not really elders, right?
Right. Okay, so you said an elder-led, congregationally ruled congregational form of government. Maybe you could walk us through, what does this look like when it comes to hiring, firing, budget decisions, any decision that's coming up? Maybe it's church discipline. What does it look like in your church model as opposed to what it would maybe look like in a different church model?
Yeah, I think that, I think sometimes when we hear congregationalism, we hear like kind of pure church democracy, where, everyone can vote on everything. And that's not, what I would mean, and what most people would mean by congregationalism. So I would mean the congregation has the final say on the membership of the church, who's included, who's removed, and the leadership of the church. So it's sort of ultimately responsible for doctrine, ultimately responsible for the theology of the church, and therefore I would say by extension the leadership who espouse that and uphold that. So what does that look like practically? Well, it would mean the elders would lead. They would come to the congregation and say, listen, we think, we need to hire this pastor, or we need to bring these people into membership, or this person needs to be removed from membership. And here's the discipline process we've been working through. But ultimately, the congregation makes the decision on whether or not that goes forward. So it takes a lot of processing. It takes a lot of trust, a lot of communication. It's a less efficient way to do those things.
Yeah.
But the good thing is it trains the congregation to take responsibility, and they have to step up, step into their role. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's man, I almost want to ask. I've got a question written down, but I want to go off of the back of that thought. You said that it trains the congregation. So this is not a guys at the top have authority. The goal is to mature the congregation. Do you think that this model of governance that you just described is actually the best for not just the people theologically, not just for order, but for their own spiritual maturity?
Yeah, I mean, you really you see it. So in our church in Abu Dhabi, we shifted from basically an elder rule. First, we instituted elders. They didn't have elders before. And then we went to a congregational model where the congregation had the final say on those ultimate decisions. And, people wake up. They're suddenly like, wait a minute, I have to decide what? And it's amazing how people tune in and lean in and start asking questions and take ownership. And of course, there's no model that guarantees that the church is going to behave well.
Right.
Unfortunately. Dang.
Polity can't shape hearts.
Right.
So I think you have to acknowledge the limits of it. Even though I believe in this kind of polity, like I'd rather be in an elder ruled church with like super godly people. Really godly congregational church. Like we have a great constitution. The people are wicked, but the constitution's awesome.
Yeah. Well, on that, so like let's say, you're leading a church of people who aren't so mature spiritually, and there are big important decisions that are being made. And what do you do in a congregational form of government when they're not mature yet, and when maybe there's this groundswell of desire for something that it's like really obvious to you as an elder who's been around the block, like this is a really bad decision. Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think you have to always, slow down, teach, disciple, and
filibuster.
Have the luxury of bringing everyone to a point of maturity, but even the process itself can be a maturing process. So I think it varies case to case. But yeah, that's the downside. That's the risk, is that you're empowering people who maybe don't feel equipped and don't feel ready.
You mentioned qualifications of an elder, like briefly. You talked about qualifications, and you said there's stuff in the New Testament and there's stuff in the Old Testament. Unpack the Old Testament stuff for us, because I constantly hear the 1 Timothy passages where they go through not given to much wine, able to teach, husband of one wife, those kinds of things. But unpack some of the Old Testament eldership. Where do we see outlines of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not as clear as First Timothy and Titus. I mean, those are wonderful character description lists, which is probably why we go straight there. It's super
Mm-hmm.
clear. But even in the Old Testament, you always find, whether there's kings or prophets or Moses or whoever, there are always these elders that are kind of like, on the stage. When Moses, makes the covenant with God, makes covenant with Israel, Mount Sinai, they go up for the covenant meal, and the 70 elders go up with him. Or in the towns, there's always these bodies of elders at the town gate that are making decisions. So the elders are always kind of popping up, and they tend to they seem to be those who have wisdom, respect, who have a measure of authority and leadership in the community. So again, it doesn't spell it out like First Timothy, therefore have this kind of character. But I think the implication is that wisdom, respect, maturity. And maybe something similar to it would be like even though they're not called elders, the judges that Moses appoints in Exodus 18. When Jethro's like, dude, you're gonna fry yourself if you keep doing all these. It's like, and it's like, who are these people? Where they're impartial and they're trustworthy and they're respected. So I think a lot of the same character qualities are there in the Old Testament too. It's just not as clearly listed.
Yeah. Okay. Now back to just the kind of three forms of government. We've talked about congregational, Episcopal, and Presbyterian. I'm curious what scriptures, like you've obviously decided on the congregational form, and from what little I know about you, I'm guessing that it wasn't just pragmatism that led you there. In fact, even your statement, it's a slower way to go. If you just want to make fast decisions, have your team of elders, or even just have your senior pastor who's just the boss and does things, right? But
that's right.
So I don't think it's pragmatism. I believe you're convicted by the Scripture. That while I hear you, you're not like condemning of other sides or anything, but like you feel like this is the best, or this is what the Scripture teaches. What's your scriptural justification for congregational form of government?
Yeah, that's a great question. And by the way, maybe we should probably add a fourth form of church government nowadays called multi-site church, huh?
Oh wow! Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, I would love to discuss
why
that.
Why not? Let's go ahead.
Multi-site
Drop
church.
it on there.
Yeah, I'm writing that one down. We're going to revisit that. So first, why don't you answer scriptural convictions of congregational government, and then multi-site. That's coming next.
Well, I'm just thinking it's a kind of polity, right? That like everyone's doing, and it doesn't fit any of the models nicely.
Yeah.
So it's sort of emerged as its own thing. Yeah. So to the scriptural basis, I think the sort of one of the key texts would be Matthew 16, where Jesus says, Matthew. I'm looking at my Bible here. Matthew 16, like 13 to 20, where Jesus says, who do the crowds say I am? Who do they say I am? Peter, who do you say I am? And he makes the confession that you're the Messiah, you're the Christ. And then he says, I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And so that's typically understood, and I would understand it that way, as an authority to open and to shut, to allow in and to remove. And so he has this sort of authority over the church. And of course, that gets into the whole Roman Catholic, debate about is Peter the first pope and all these things. But what's interesting is when you go to Matthew 18, go forward 2 chapters where Jesus gives the instructions for what to do in the case of church discipline. And he, says, okay, if, your brother sins against you, go one-on-one, try to win him over. If you did, you won your brother, great. If not, take 2 witnesses. If not, tell it to the church. And then it says, if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile tax collector. And then he brings up the same line. Truly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So it seems now that same authority given to Peter is being given to the congregation. And then, he says, again, I say, if 2 or 3 of you agree on earth about anything I anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. And people often, quote that as kind of the, I call it the small Bible study turnout verse. It's like,
I love it.
Like, oh, dang, only 3 people. Well, what do you guys want to do? You guys want to go see a movie? Let's go
Matthew 18:20.
Hey,
and
God's
here.
really here
Well,
with us. There's at least 3
2
of
or
us.
3 are gathered.
That's just calling balls and strikes, man. That's just
man.
the way it is. You get 3 people together, and it's, hey, where 2 or 3 are gathered, guys. Anytime there's a small turnout. I've heard
I love
that
it.
1,000 times.
Or like even agreement, so I think like this agreement thing, it's not like, hey, if the 3 of us agree on anything in prayer, like Josh is getting a Lamborghini, so like let's agree.
Oh, let's do it. Let's agree, guys.
Yeah.
So that passage is not. Can you just, I guess, double down on that, because that's something that I've come into a bit of resistance to in explaining. Hey, when 2 or 3 come into agreement, it's done in heaven. What does that look like? That doesn't look like me and Michael coming to agreement on who's going to be the next president, and suddenly that person's going to be president. Can you double down on showing that is about church governance?
Yeah. So I think in the context, he's Jesus is. It's all in the context of church discipline, and in other words, he's telling the church that they have this heavenly authority. That if 2 or 3, in other words, who are the 2 or 3? Well, they're probably the 2 or 3 witnesses that were just a few verses earlier, who are bringing to the church, this charge, and the whole church is now calling this person to account. So I think it's like, look, you have the authority, you have the keys to bind or to loose. And I don't think that to mean that we save or unsave people.
Sure.
But it's to sort of publicly recognize them as disciples, or to publicly take away that mantle of being identified as a disciple, which historically has been called church discipline or excommunication.
Now you brought up the multi-site, and it felt, and I don't know, it felt as if there might have been a little bit of saltiness there. You want to unpack multi-site for us?
I'm just saying it's a 4th model. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. But I don't mean to be pro it either.
Well, could there be? So, what are the challenges to church governance, to biblical church governance with multi-site? And can you imagine a way that it's done that's actually appropriate?
I think the challenges to a multi-site church, I think pastorally, if it was a multi-site model where I was a pastor of a campus that I never really visited, like I don't know in what sense I'm really a shepherd, or that I'm, it says,
how exactly will you give an account?
How am I going to give an account? Yeah, Hebrews, right. So how am I going to give an account for those souls? I don't know. I don't know how to shepherd those people that I've never even met. I don't know how I would ever, as a church member or as a pastor, be a part of church membership or church discipline in a church where those people aren't there. I think there's just basic questions. What is a church? Is the church fundamentally a shared vision, a shared budget, a shared admin team, or is the church not in fact a family of people who are actually gathered together in a place and are committed to each other, know each other, and are committed to the one another's with each other, with shepherds who know them. So I don't know how it works. I mean, I know it works, and I know the Lord works, and I know that people are being saved, and so I'm not questioning any of that. It's just those are things I would struggle with. More like, hey, Jeramie, why don't you apply for this job here at this multi-site church? These are the things that would be, my theological hangups that I would deal with.
Now, is that? I mean, could somebody say the same thing about a pastor of a megachurch of some thousands of people? I know in Abu Dhabi you pastored a large church. Do you know every single person in a large church? Could you say the same thing with that? Like, might somebody come back and say, well, that pastor is overseeing these pastors who are pouring into those people, and do you see some justification in that regard?
Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I think this it's kind of a practical question. Like, how many people could I actually know and shepherd? Um, and I think it's obviously a limited number, right? And yet I don't think that should be the limitation on the size of the church. I mean, the early church in Jerusalem, I mean, it got to like 5,000, right, before the persecution broke out and they scattered. So that was, the first church of the Bible is a mega church by modern categories.
Right.
So, but somehow they managed to, the apostles managed to teach and shepherd and oversee. So yeah, I would just say the task gets more challenging. And I don't think that in a large, so like in my church in Abu Dhabi, we had 1,000 people on a Friday. We worshiped on Friday because it was a Muslim holy day, and so we had 1,000 people, but like maybe 500 some members. But even 500 some members, it's hard to really know everyone deeply. But what I found is that among an elder team that's really doing its job, there's a kind of collective knowledge of everybody, and I'm there, right? So if on a Sunday, this brother from Nigeria who's a member of the church wants to talk to me, like I'm right there, and I'm accessible. So which I think is, if I was in a multi-site situation, I just don't know how I would do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've got a question from Brandon in here. He says, what about online church? And I'm going to kind of expand on his question because, well, it's my show and he's not sitting here to expand on it. So as far as online church, and specifically when it comes to elders, so like we can unpack, what about online church? Not is it biblical, is it not biblical, but how do, with the pandemic, with things that are going on right now, lots of people are moving to online. How does a pastor, or can a pastor, an elder, be really responsible for an online body?
Yeah, I mean, I do think online church is an oxymoron.
Dang.
I think church is a physical assembly of people. Now, I do think that we have this crazy situation where it's almost like we have this new category of COVID shut-ins. Mm-hmm. Who just can't, the church has always had shut-ins, right? People who can't make it, who are members of the church, but who can't make it to the assembly. And so we have to show special care and concern for them. I think the problem now is there's just like huge numbers in churches. And then in some churches, so like here where I'm now in Florida, we can meet in the church's meeting. Some states, right, they're not even meeting, they can't meet. And so I just think it's a very peculiar time where shepherding just has to look different, and you just kind of have to do what you can with the situation. It's not ideal, but in some ways I think it's the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, and for those of you who are watching, I would also really encourage to unpack that conversation. You can go check out a video I'm just updating right now in the description, so it's in there right now. Is online church biblical? We interviewed an Anglican, a classical Pentecostal, a Method-ish is what we like to call them, and a Baptist person. And then me and Michael were there, and we talked about, right as the pandemic started, is online church biblical? And all of these guys from different denominations actually came to a very similar conclusion.
Yeah, you can search for that episode.
Some of the nuances. I dropped it in the description, and we'll put a card up there or something.
Yeah. No. So I'm kind of curious. I mean, what do you? Well, I guess I could just say, what do you think of what MacArthur's doing, or some pastors who it's like in their state where everything's shut down? If Florida shut down, would you still meet, or would you not meet?
Yeah, well, it did shut down for a little bit, and the church did stop meeting for a little bit. But I think, everyone had a sense in Florida, because of its political climate, that the shutdown was not going to last long. And I mean, it's wide open now. I don't know what I would do. I think it would depend upon how long. I think it would depend upon factors like, how long do I perceive this shutdown is going to happen? Is it being done justly and equitably among other public gatherings? Is the church being singled out? And I think in MacArthur's case, part of what he was arguing was, hey, look, the other things are not shut down. And,
right.
And so there's, or Mark Dever's case, the Capitol Hill Baptist took, against DC. saying that they were, they were trying to have outdoor services, and they were like, look, the mayor of DC was going to these large outdoor events. So I think it would depend, but certainly there's a place. I think there is a place for civil disobedience. Probably me personally, I'd be a little slower to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. So maybe we can start unpacking qualifications of an elder that we talked about in 1 Timothy chapter 3, and like you said in Titus, and maybe kind of unpack some of those for us.
Yeah. So just turning over there to 1 Timothy and Titus. I think the thing that's most remarkable is how much the qualifications are focused on character, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think oftentimes when we think about leadership, it's all about gifting.
Mm-hmm.
Is someone winsome? Are they, charismatic? Influential? And yet when you look at 1 Timothy 3, when you look at Titus, when you look at 1 Peter 5, those kinds of passages, I mean, it's all these things like sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, above reproach, right? This kind of blanket statement, which is really challenging. So I think godly character and right, like, isn't this kind of crisis in the evangelical church? Is you have these two kind of moral failures that seem to keep happening with pastors. One is moral failure in sexual immorality. But the other is like, high-handedness and authoritarianism and these character flaws where they're not humble and they're not godly, and it brings the ministry down. So yeah, it's really interesting to me that the characters there. I think another key qualification is aspiration. If anyone desires, this is 1 Timothy 3, if anyone desires to be an overseer, he desires a noble task. So I think there should be something in you that's like hungering to be an elder. It shouldn't be like you're doing it because you feel guilty and they need one more slot, on the roster or something like that. Husband of one wife. I do believe in male eldership. I think that's clearly taught in the New Testament. And it's interesting, by the way, that there's a kind of family qualification that a man has to lead his family well. And I think it's because really the elders are kind of like this body of spiritual fathers over the family of the local church. And if you think about it, maybe that's one other way to think about eldering instead of the shepherding model is kind of parenting. Eldering is parenting. You're trying to be a good role model, you're teaching, you're overseeing, you're kind of coaching and encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
And just as in parenting, the goal is to like raise up fully mature kids. So in eldering, the goal is to raise up. I think you really see that in Ephesians chapter 4. So the whole body grows up into maturity, into Him who is the head, that is Christ. That imagery of a maturing body. So the elders are kind of spiritual fathers teaching.
Yeah. All right, you just mentioned Ephesians 4, so I got to jump on that. We just did an episode on the New Apostolic Reformation recently. You guys should check that out.
Cool.
But and so there's very big emphasis on the fivefold ministry: apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher. Some people make that for pastor, teacher, but anyway, they call it the fivefold, and so that's just like a huge part of it. And so they tried to have each of those functions within their leadership within each church. So I won't have you necessarily comment on the NAR expression of it, but what does apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher look like in your churches? Like how do these play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I understand apostles and the gift of apostleship, it is those who were eyewitnesses of the resurrection. And who were given a special responsibility of testifying as eyewitnesses. I also think they were used to lay the foundation of the New Testament that we have. So I do think we have apostolic authority in the church. I think it's the New Testament scriptures, and that's where the apostolic authority lies. Even Paul, when he lists all the apostles to whom Christ appeared in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "And last of all, to me, as one untimely born." He's the last. part of the way I would take that. So, prophets, of course, that's a big debate, nowadays. What is prophecy? Is there prophecy today? So I would be very, very, very uncomfortable with someone who claims to be an apostle today. If in terms of prophecy, I think that's a more live issue, and is challenging either way, but it to me is not so much of a red flag as those claiming to be apostles. Yeah.
Right. And then the evangelist one, like what does that look like? I mean, do you see these as in some way playing into church government, or more just like functions that, I mean, setting the apostle debate aside, just functions that should play a role somewhere in the church?
Are these gifts that are internally functioning within the church, or these governing bodies, like you need the evangelist to speak into whether we're going to do the trunk or treat this year, or we got to redeem the cult.
I'm so glad we have Ephesians 4:11 so we can make the trunk or treat decision.
That's right. So how do you understand evangelists, pastors,
you guys
teachers?
Are fearless in the topics you address. This is this is like the third rail. Did they just go there? Did they just go to trunk or treat?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah,
we did.
Hard. Yeah, I would see them. I would see them as gifts and functions, not so much as governing offices. Right.
Okay, got it. So you mentioned these qualifications. You get sober-mindedness, self-control, hospitable, above reproach, husband of one wife, making sure they have aspirations, those kinds of things. Now, there have been recent. I mean, at the making of this video, there have been recent failures in these areas, but if you're watching 6 months from now, there's been recent failures in those areas as well. So some big pastor somewhere has done something that they shouldn't have. That being said, when we're looking at these kinds of qualifications, at what point do we start, tossing the red flag on the plate? I mean, husband of one wife is pretty simple, right? Like, you don't want to break that one. It's really easy to figure that out. But like sober-minded, self-controlled, like at what point in time does the church or the other elders stand up and go, "Hey, man, you're eating too much pizza. Like, you're not being self-controlled." Like what? Where's that line of like really getting?
You're gonna have to step down from eldership.
Yeah, that's the question. Too much pizza? Like, where's the line?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's so many decisions, I think, in church leadership, and you guys probably know from leadership in your own churches, there's so many decisions that just require wisdom.
Yeah.
And wisdom, is this combination of biblically the fear of the Lord and biblically informed thinking, but also just kind of reading complex situations and thinking about all the different ways that Scripture applies, and then sometimes making judgment calls based on that. And so I think sometimes there's people who, you say, I'm not sure if this guy is ready to be an elder, and it's not like you can, give a numeric value to that or something. But you have to use wisdom, and I think
6
that's
pizzas. You're out.
How many pizzas?
4 pieces? You're okay.
Yeah. It's like an interview test. You put a pizza in front of it.
Is he qualified? It's got to be like a pizza by Alfredo.
Two-way mirror. Some guys like, no. Don't reach for it. No.
So, with talking about self-control, talking about wisdom and those kinds of aspects, who does that, right? Like, at what point in time does the church get concerned? Like if I'm concerned about Michael and I'm attending Michael's church as a congregant, as an elder, you're supposed to be charged with 2 witnesses. Like how does that process work? Because what seems to be happening is that one of these things were either never present, they were never qualified for this role, or these things slowly creep in, and it's hard. It's really, really hard to determine, man, like he made a mistake, or hey, he made a couple of mistakes, or there's a pattern of mistakes here, versus like that's just such a small line, and it seems as if the church is just so quick to jump on people. Like, hey, there was this guy who had this moral failure recently. He's repentant of it. He's getting counseling with his wife. His church was open and honest about it. We don't know how long it went on, but hey, it seems like everyone's approaching this the right way. And it seems like the church just wants to bash. There's another pastor. He screwed up. He failed. Like how how can we be more hospitable? How can we catch these things early? How can we, talk about failures and shortcomings in this way so that we're not eating our own?
Yeah, I mean, great question, and I think yeah, it's interesting how we often are so zealous for the gospel, but there isn't that kind of note of grace in our lives. We go to the mat for the doctrines of grace, but like where is the grace?
Yeah.
And so I do think that can often be the case. And in churches, it's hard. The churches they seem to either fall off one side of the cliff or the other. They either turn a blind eye to it and ignore the pastor's sins and don't do anything about it, or it's like you messed up. We're gonna put down old Yeller here, and that's it.
Right.
And there's no grace, and there's no hope, and there's got to be some path in the middle, right? And it has to involve repentance. It has to involve real close community and people speaking into that person's life. And so I do think people can be restored. Pastors can be restored, but it's often a longer, more intense road than, and which is probably why it's easier just to ignore it or be like, well, we're done with that guy and whatever, God will take care of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On those list of qualifications, one of them is able to teach. And I'm curious, what do you think of the model where a lead pastor teaches, almost every single week with an occasional, usually guest speaker, usually from the outside, or it might be from the inside if it's a bigger church, but anyway, what do you think of a model like this versus something more of like a team teaching model?
Yeah, I think team teaching is great to aspire to and to work toward, and I think it's really healthy for a church to see, even if you have one guy who's like the lead pastor who does a higher percentage of preaching. I think it's so healthy for churches to see a team teaching model and to be kind of coaching and training guys up to get to that point. And I think able to teach can take a lot of forms. Like I really think what able to teach means is to be able to hold to the sound teaching and refute those who oppose it. And so I don't think it means you have to be able to step onto the stage at Gospel Coalition 2021 and speak to 5,000 people and hold them in rapt attention for 45 minutes. I think that's like one kind of type of preaching gifts, but I think if you can sit across the table from a guy with a cup of coffee and try to just walk him through scriptures and explain the scriptures, and you're able to teach. Whether or not you can do that in a monologue for 45 minutes is kind of a different question.
Well, that's super encouraging. I'm still qualified. Okay. Because I was really comparing on that Gospel Coalition thing. So Matthew Holmes asked a question about divorced men. I think he's pulling it from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, talking about the husband of one wife. Is it possible to be an elder or pastor if he hasn't been remarried? It's kind of a controversial subject. What do you think?
Yeah, it's very complex, and part of it is the ambiguity of the Greek grammar. Mm-hmm. So it's a one woman man, and of course the Greek word for woman is also the same Greek word for wife, and the Greek word for man is also the same Greek word for husband. So it's one way to take that is that it's a faithful husband. So take it more metaphorically, it's a husband who's faithful to his wife, who's a good husband. One of the challenges I see is if you take it as you can only have one wife and therefore it excludes divorce and remarriage. Well, does it also exclude then someone who's widowed and gets remarried? Because they've technically had two wives, and I've read some who argue that. But that becomes kind of problematic. Or what if he's divorced but never remarried? I mean, he's still the husband of one wife. So you kind of descend into a complex casuistry there. So I think it's a tough one to interpret. I tend to land on the side of a faithful husband because of that. It just seems it doesn't play out well if someone is, widowed and as a widower and remarries. I just would have no problem having them as an elder. But if it's going to be technically one wife, well, then what do I do?
Okay, cool. Hey, we have a question from a guy named Dawson. He says, why does the Christian consumer complex create celebrity pastors? So could you speak into the celebrity pastor thing?
Yeah, it's really, it's a mess. It's unhealthy. It's not good for the pastor. It's not good for the church. And I think sometimes it just happens without people trying to make it happen. I think, you get a really gifted pastor and or God's just blessing his ministry and many people are coming to faith and the Lord is moving. And just because of our context as, consumers, we sort of interpret that and experience that in a certain way. And it just kind of falls into the celebrity category. But yeah, I think it's important to work against that as much as we can. So I don't know why it happens, except that it's kind of human nature and it's kind of American culture, and it needs to be resisted.
And how do we resist it? What can churches do to resist it? And can you think of any examples where it's been resisted well by pastors who do have that sort of magnetic personality, charisma, gifting, etc., but they've resisted it well?
I think one of my heroes in that regard is Mark Dever. I've known him through 9 Marks ministry, and he's a guy who's like ridiculously gifted. I just his ability, his intellect, his mastery of information, his winsomeness, his force of personality. He's just a force of nature. But he, on his elder board, is constantly deferring to other elders and is willing to lose votes. He's constantly, the percentage of Sundays that he preaches in his church is surprisingly low compared to what a typical pastor does. He's always raising people up. He's always, putting the theology forward and not himself forward. And so somehow I just watch him and I see someone who could easily sort of build something around himself, and he's just constantly pushing it away. So I think it takes a lot of intentionality to make sure that doesn't happen.
No, he's very intentional about it. I invited him on the show, and he told me no. No, I'm just kidding. He did tell me no, though.
You sound still bitter.
I love Mark Dever. I have like a theology man crush on his celebrityness. Okay,
I didn't know that was a thing.
I'm just kidding. I think he is awesome, though. We talked about all of the qualifications given here in 1 Timothy and Titus. Like, they're mostly character. Like, why on earth are we not why are we applying this to pastors, right? Like, I look at this list, sober-minded, that should be all Christians. Self-controlled, that should be all Christians. Hospitable, like, I would hold any Christian accountable to these things. Like, husband of one wife, okay, so the men Christians, okay? But still, like, all of these things seem like average Christian standards. Why are these qualifications for elders and not just Christians everywhere?
And I think the answer is they are. And because part of a pastor's job is to be a role model, to be an example for the flock. Like Paul, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so I think you're exactly right. Like, these are things that every Christian should aspire to, and elders should just be kind of living examples. So when you see an elder, you should look at him and be like, man, I want to be like that guy, and I want to lead my wife the way he does, or I want to be patient the way he is, and so we should aspire to those things. So yeah, I think that's right, because elders are leading by example.
Yeah. I'm curious, what do you see as the relationship between like elder and staff? Because you have maybe some paid elders, some lay elders, but then maybe some staff members. Like, I mean, maybe there's youth pastor. We actually had a question earlier. Is that biblical youth pastor? Maybe you have like a worship director who's, leading some worship. But I mean, how does all of that work?
Yeah, it does get tricky because because of the dual relationship that a staff person has to the church. On the one hand, they're a spiritual leader, but on the other hand, they're also in the employ of the church, and so it creates a kind of messy relationship. So on the pastor level, I believe that if you're going to give someone the title of pastor on your staff, that they are functioning as an elder. That a pastor is an elder, is an overseer. I think those three terms are used interchangeably in the New Testament. So so if I'm going to call someone a pastor, I really think they should be an elder. But then it gets complex because some things elders talk about are like the salary of the employees. So it's because of the double relationship that's there. I do think that there has to be practical ways to consider that. So like when I was in Abu Dhabi, one of the things we wrote into our constitution, our bylaws change, was that there had to be more lay elders than staff elders, so that like we couldn't abuse power and take over and lay hold of the finances because it would directly benefit us. We also made a thing in the bylaws that the associate pastors couldn't have votes on anything related to staffing in the church or the finances of staffing unless the other elders deemed it okay. And so we just because we recognize that dual relationship. And then, ministry directors typically are people who have responsibility for programs. So I don't know. I'm not sure where they fit. They're kind of deacons, kind of like deacons. They're I don't know. They're sort of, I would say they're closer to deacons in my mind. But
you want to talk about deacons for a minute?
Yeah, Brandon has a question. He goes, what's the difference between elders and deacons? And Dawson, on the heels of that, is there a difference between bishops and shepherds? Or bishops and elder? Well, I guess bishops and shepherds, because those are the pastor words.
So, bishop, elder, deacon, unpack all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the second question, I see the elder, the pastor, or shepherd. That's what pastor means. Pastor is just the Latin word for shepherd. So elders, overseers, and pastors as all the same job. Okay. So if you want to, you could theologically and accurately call your elders bishop. If you really wanted to give them an ego. And I think you see that in Acts chapter 20, where Paul says, he's speaking to the elders. And he says, shepherd the flock of God, which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Sort of these just willing to use these terms interchangeably. For Peter 5, same thing. Those terms are all interchangeable. As far as deacons, I understand deacons to be servants in the church who took on administrative and service functions so that the elders can do the shepherding work. So, that if the elders are primarily the teachers, it's interesting in the qualification list for elders and deacons have a lot of the same character qualifications as elders. The one thing that elders have that deacons don't have is that they have to be able to teach, whereas deacons don't have to be able to teach. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of roles in the church that are diaconal roles that make use of all kinds of gifts in the body that you don't have to be an elder to use your gifts and be a great servant to the body.
I was just at a church in Missouri last week, and it seems like their team of leaders that lead their church are composed of elders and deacons, and they kind of co-lead the church together. And it seems as if their elders are also people who can fill the pulpit, where their deacons, they still get the same kind of vote in the direction of the church, but aren't able to teach. Would you be comfortable with that kind of distinction?
Yeah, I think I would struggle if the deacons are being called upon to oversee the whole church. I'd be fine with conversations between those different bodies, and I do think that elders need to listen to the flock. They need to listen to deacons. They don't just make decisions from a star chamber. But I'd be concerned about just kind of confusing elder and deacon role and seeing the deacons being a part of all deciding together on the oversight of the whole body. I think that's a special duty given to elders.
Okay, a question from Jared R. He asks, "Are female deacons aight?" That's how he worded it.
Oh, well, I think we get the interpretation there.
What's that?
I meaning all right.
Yeah. That's what it means. No, for sure. So he's asking about female deaconesses.
Deaconesses.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, no slang without interpretation, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's a debatable matter of interpret. So even among those who are, we'll call themselves complementarians, one of the debates is, can there be female deacons? And a lot of it hinges on the fact that women are mentioned in 1 Timothy 3:8. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy to dishonest gain. They must hold to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them be tested, and let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. It sounds a lot like elders. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded. But the problem there again is the word wife, or is it the word woman? Women likewise. And what's interesting is that word likewise, when it appears, I would take it to be describing a new category of person, because that's how it also appears in verse 8. So I would see this as deacons, and then women who are also serving as deacons. But it could be wives, and so it's kind of a debatable matter there. And some would argue, why is it then that deacons' wives have qualifications, but elders' wives don't? So it seems a little bit strange. There's a great debate article, two articles. I think one's written by Tom Schreiner in 9 Marks, and the other one's written by Alexander Strock. And Strock argues for male-only deacons, and then Schreiner argues for female deacons. It's a great. So just go look. I think it's 9 Marks that posted that.
I'm looking it up right now. I'll have it in the description of the video afterward.
Yeah. And then they respond to each other. So it's like one of those two views thing. Very helpful.
Very good. Awesome. Another question. Jared's got another question. Who plants churches in the Bible, elders or apostles? Well, we've already heard your understanding of the apostles thing, but basically, who is supposed to plant churches? Just new elders being raised up, or what?
Yeah, I mean, you see the apostles planting churches, but who planted the church in Antioch?
Just
we have no idea.
People who went around talking about Jesus.
The brothers.
It was just people who fled, and so Christians showed up in Antioch, but we actually don't know who planted the church in Antioch.
Yeah, no, we support a mission in Cuba, and it's very house church oriented, in part because the Cuban government requires them to meet in homes, and they do have some church buildings. It's kind of weird, but anyway, just a lot of house churches, and for them, if you're a disciple, you're a church planter. And so they're just going around, and everybody's just making disciples and starting new things in their home. It's growing like wildfire. It's pretty wild.
It's crazy. Apparently, if you tell everyone they're a church planter, you plant lots of churches. That's what Michael said. That's revolutionary.
It creates interesting conversations for complementarians such as myself.
Oh, no doubt.
Anyway,
cool. Well, thank you so much.
That's a whole nother discussion.
I think we're coming to that last point in our show where we want to wrap everything up, give our last closing thoughts. So Jeramie, I'll ask you here in a moment, that golden nugget, people are walking away thinking about elders. What is the one thing that you really want people to consider and to think about as they're walking away, talking about elders, thinking about elders? Michael, we'll start with you. Give Jeramie a second to get his thoughts out there.
Sure. Yeah, I think just the fact that, Paul lists one after another character traits for eldership. And so I think that when you're looking for a church, go to a church where you trust the elders' character. Don't just go to the church that's got the most charismatic speaker necessarily. There's nothing wrong with that. But if those are the characteristics that are for elders, then those are the kinds of churches that we should be seeking. Churches that have a plurality of elders, and churches where those elders are shepherding and have righteous character. Because our character formation, and I know we tend to think if I just pray and I read my Bible, then I'm going to be good. But in reality, my character formation is going to be very much dependent upon the kind of church I decide to go to. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so go to a church that has biblical eldership. Go to a church with real shepherds, not just programs. So I think that's what I would say.
That's great. Jeramie, your thoughts, sir?
I guess I would say, especially to men out there, aspire to be an elder, and really like go from being a passive dude, whose wife is kind of the de facto spiritual force in the family, and like, man, grow and aspire. And, there's a place for you. You don't have to go to seminary. You don't have to be a trained pastor, quote unquote. And so I just encourage men to aspire to eldership, to be whether or not you end up being an elder, to be the kind of person who could be. And I think that would be great. And of course, women too, just aspiring to having that character and godliness. But I think sometimes it's men who are kind of, we're kind of lazy, right? And we sort of are passive, and we don't do our job. So yeah, I would just say aspire, bros, and grow toward it.
Yeah, that's been my thought throughout this, is since we've been talking about multi-site, going to the Village for a while, Matt has spun off all of the churches, all the campuses as autonomous churches, pastored by their own local pastor, preached by their own local pastor preaches. He doesn't stream into those spaces any longer, and that's something that I would really advise for people who are looking to be a part of a church, looking at the character of people who are really willing to like give away authority and to give away control. I think that is a beautiful sign of maturity in Christ. And so as you guys are watching this video, what I'd really encourage you to do, go down into the description of the video. You can see PayPal links if you want to donate, Patreon if you want to be a monthly giver to the ministry. We have videos on Patreon that are exclusive as thank yous to those who give monthly to the ministry. Thank you, crew, for telling me which camera was on. And then we have social links if you want to follow us on Facebook or Instagram. The book that was mentioned today by Jeramie, that's going to be in the description of the video, is Online Church Biblical. It's a link to our YouTube video, and the 2 views of Women Deacons that is also in the description of the video. A big thank you to Jeramie for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Enjoyed the conversation. Enjoy your books, and encourage anybody out there who's watched the video, you've liked it, man, check out the book. It will impact you and your church community. It was a blessing. So we'll see you guys next time, Monday night, 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, or Tuesdays from 4 to 5. Tomorrow we've got 2 shows, one with Max Lucado talking about the gifts of the Spirit, and then soon following Max, we've got another episode.
Joel Richardson
discussing prophecies.
Messianic prophecies. So,
It's
end
gonna be
times.
exciting. Yeah. Anyway, we'll see you guys next time. Be blessed.